Right, good morning. Um, this is we're starting very early today, and I think that my colleagues on the line and also fellow panelists are probably still trying to wake up. But there is no better way to start the day than to break bread with sisters if you're not a morning person like myself. My name is Masako Mazamwise. I'm going to be the facilitator for today's session. And our topic for today's discussion is theories of change for constructing feminist counter-hegemonies. We are starting, it's like we're kicking off today's theme, which is strategies for change and resistance. And it's day 3 of the South Feminist Festival. One of our sisters yesterday, Nancy, reminded us that in the festival, a lot of sisters have criticized how we within the women's rights movement have used theories of change as a methodology, especially within the NGOs, and built programs around them. And that they don't, the theories that we're using and the way that we're engaging with them don't have any of the issues that often are sites for organizing and sites for feminist struggles for counter-hegemony. The wealth of knowledge that comes out in the work that feminist sisters have been doing as part of the anti-globalization movement historically, drawing attention to the political economy of organizing and of social movements, but also just the political economy of who globalization benefits and who is framing the discourse around globalization. The organizing against anti-neoliberalism organizing, the organizing that we have seen sisters drive around anti-racism, and the rollback of democracy, and a whole lot of issues that sisters have historically organized around. And today I'm really happy to have 3 panelists who have been embedded in a lot of the movements to share with us what their own perspectives have been on understanding the theories that have influenced progressive women's rights movements in countering hegemonies, both globally and in the global South. I've got Sarah Mukasa, who currently works as Deputy Director of the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa. Sarah Mukasa, who currently is the Deputy Director of the Open Society Initiative of Eastern Africa. You can see I need 2 more cups of coffee. She has worked in the field of human rights and gender equality in Africa with over 15 years as senior manager and leadership in the not-for-profit sector in Africa and Europe. Sarah's work spans from community organizing to the strategic public policy engagement in international spaces such as the UN and the African Union. She has devoted herself to build strong, autonomous, and resilient civil society institutions that can offer alternatives to address long-standing concerns on poverty, exclusion, and discrimination. Sarah, we are so glad to have you today. Good morning to you. We also have with us Aria Mojino, who is a feminist economist and organizer from Luanda. Her practice, analysis, and activism interrogates how macroeconomic policies affect women's rights and their intersections with power, inequality, and justice. Aria is a coordinator of the Onjango Feminista Collective and currently works as the Economic and Social Justice Program Manager for the Open Society Initiative in Southern Africa in Angola. And last but not least is Muthoni Murithi. Muthoni is an African feminist and human rights lawyer from Nairobi, Kenya, with over 15 years of experience in women's human rights, feminist movement building, legislative policy reform, gender advocacy, and campaigning. She previously led an Africa-wide campaign on ending violence against women and girls, the Enough campaign at Oxfam International, which applied feminist strategies in shifting societal forms that reinforce and normalize against women. She is currently the Senior Gender Policy Manager at Worldwide Foundation, working to advocate for online gender equality. I couldn't have asked for a better group of sisters to have this conversation with. I'm going to turn over to you and perhaps start with Sarah to please share with us what is the history and what are the emerging trends of constructing feminist counter-hegemony responses. What are we seeing, but what also has been the history of organizing around these issues, taking into account organizing against globalization, capitalism, racism, debt, the class struggles, and much more of what feminist sisters in the Global South have been working on. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Masejo. And I'm not sure I'm qualified to give a comprehensive history of feminist organizing, you know, even on the continent of Africa, which is the context I am most familiar with. And more importantly, to do that within the space of sort of 5 minutes. So 5 or so minutes in the beginning of this session. But thank you so much for this invitation, and thank you so much for organizing this South Feminist Forum. It's a breath of fresh air in the context of what we are facing, both on the continent and globally. You know, in terms of our struggles as feminists, working at the sort of intersections of decolonialization, decoloniality, class struggles, and globalization. I'm going to give a very broad summary of my understanding and just say that, you know, at least for me, I have known, I believe that feminist struggles have been existing in Africa and in the African diasporas for as long as we have had the traditions of white supremacy, you know, colonialism, slavery, and so on. I remember reading at age 6 the now famous quote from Sojourner Truth at the sort of old stone church in Akron, Ohio, where white American women were discussing, you know, the emancipation of white women, where she stood up and asked, "Hello, ain't I a woman? Ain't I a woman?" And moved the congregation. I think broadly in Africa, I can talk about sort of 3 phases of feminist organizing. And the first phase, I would say, would be the sort of anti-colonialist or the pre-independence movements, in which women sought not necessarily to address their own sort of, you know, sort of heteropatriarchal oppression within the African sort of pre-independence societies, but really lent their efforts towards independent struggles. Either in, we have stories of African women who were very active agents of anti-colonial struggles, and who risked life and limb in order to either provide safety, provide welfare, and provide the actual sort of thinking and strategizing around sort of independence struggles. Now, these histories are only just beginning to come to light. And one has to search very, very intensely to find them. And it's only through sort of feminist, African feminist scholars, academics, and thinkers, many of whom are here today, people like Amina Mama, Sylvia Tamale, Owino Okech, who are making these histories come alive. Women in Nigeria, women in South Africa, women, even in my own country, little country, Uganda, and just how much they contributed to sort of the post-colonial struggles, the independent struggles. We then get to a phase at the sort of post-independence, where I think largely, and this is very general and broadly speaking, the struggles were for access for women and girls to essential and basic services such as education, such as health, and such as, water and sanitation and so on. Now, these were largely within a sort of a determined colonial framework, for example, around public health, which had a very specific aim around public health and the Africans' place within the context of public health, as limiting vectors of infection, so that a labor force, a cheap labor force, could be maintained with the sort of minimum sort of primary healthcare objectives. So many of these struggles were around gaining access, but not necessarily challenging the sort of structural, I mean, in a sense, they were challenging the structural, hegemonies in terms of race and gender, because at the time there was a general belief that, access to education was the preserve of certain groups of people. And so in many ways that was transformatory, to be able to push for those. But it was always within a sort of centralized, sort of top-down, I guess, sort of approach. I think we see much later, and I'm skipping over this very, very generally. We see much later, we see much later the rise of sort of people power movements that are disparate, anti-globalist structures, anti-neoliberal structures, struggles around land, struggles around violence against women, struggles that locate African women's struggle for autonomy and link those very, very closely, economically, politically, and socially, to the place of Africa within the global sort of world order and structure. I, for example, consider myself a Pan-African feminist because I feel that my engagement and my activism is at the intersection of the issues around my own sort of bodily integrity and my autonomy and my agency as a woman and as a person who has been excluded and marginalized on the basis of sex and gender identity, but also in terms of one's race, one's class, and linking that to, I cannot separate my my search for autonomy from that of Africa's place within the global. So it's a contestation and it's a partnership sort of approach that we see with many of the sort of rise of people power movements, young people feel fees must fall movements, you know, all of these linking the sort of intersections of race, of gender identity, and so on. It's an exciting time, but it's also a very scary time because, you know, so I see many phases of feminist organizing, and in many ways in which there have been shifts in understanding and in connection, but also in many ways when we see sort of the Arab Spring, the revolutions in Sudan, we see the centrality of women's place to bring about those changes. And then when those changes come, we see the sort of elite bargaining that happens to push the interests of women and of feminist struggles to the periphery. And so this I think is an exciting moment to really discuss how we then move from that to achieving, you know, permanent change. Yeah.
Sarah, thank you so much for taking us through that historical analysis. And I did this deliberately because, one, you've been working and part of the women's rights movements for a very long time. So if there was anybody who was going to give us a sense of where the organizing has been and what the history is, there is no better person than you to do that. But I like and I speak out of tongue when I say history, because you were very deliberate in saying her story, and I think you capture it so well. The reason being, a lot of the discussions around organizing for counter hegemony hardly ever acknowledges the role that women played and the role that women's rights movements, particularly Pan-African women's rights movements, have played in shaping the discourse and the narrative, including the conceptualization, right? If you were to look up the theories around this, there's a lot that comes up in terms of the work that Peter Evans has done, a lot that comes up in terms of, you know, citing what Gramsci spoke about when he was talking about cultural hegemony and so forth. But I like that you actually paid homage to the work that our African sisters have been doing to help us understand what is happening, right? Akina Mama, Sylvia Tamali, and a few others that you mentioned. I think that is very important for us to talk about, to stop this erasure of women's contribution and the erasure Lebohan talks about unmemory and the erasure of memory, and I'm glad that there's a panel discussion that's going to be taking this forward. I'd like to move the conversation along, having gone through that, and invite Muthoni to also build on what you were saying about what we're seeing in the form of emerging trends of constructing feminist counter hegemony. Sarah started talking about what we're seeing young people do around the fees must fall, decolonization, and a few others. Muthoni, what is your sense in terms of the trends, the emerging trends that we're seeing? And please feel free to also add on to what Sarah also shared around her story.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. And this is such a great panel. And I think Sarah's introduction really is amazing because it segues nicely into what I was thinking, especially around the question of erasure. Just a few things. So when I'm thinking of trends, there is something about the way in which women are participating in social movements. And I take the example of, say, Sudan, the Sudan Revolution. And I'm also wary of the way the media has individualized the struggle
Mm,
when highlighting an individual in the movement. So whereas there is an importance of really showcasing and making sure that the stories of women in the struggle are front and center, the individualization of the struggle to me is a problem because in the sense that it doesn't tell us the whole story of how collective organizing works, right?
mm,
So, for example, when we think of Sudan, we have Sata, who's an amazing activist, feminist, championing for the Sudan revolution. But at the same time, we don't get to understand the broader conversation of a feminist collective struggle
mm,
towards the Sudanese revolution,
mm,
right? And the story is then placed on her to carry alone. And I think that's
mm,
some of what we see as later when we talk about fragmentation. We start to see the conflict between the individual story and the collective story. Similarly, I think one of the trends that I think is really interesting was when I think of the feminist collective in Nigeria and the way that young feminists were able to organize in the NSAS movement. I think that is really interesting in understanding how feminist movements are really not only organizing and making sure that information gets to those who need to get it and making sure that they document what is happening in struggles or social movements, but as well as thinking of different alternative ways of fundraising. So what struck me was how they were able to, for example, crowdsource resources that were mobilized to the social movement, to the movement itself, but also even the idea of using, for example, Bitcoin as an
mm,
alternative to
mm,
challenging the
mm,
blockages that they were experiencing Nigeria in terms of resource mobilization. So I think those her stories, as Sarah has said, are so important because, as you rightly pointed out, when we do come to tell this story, this is what gets erased from the struggle. Say, for example, the end SARS, and I think I'm seeing movements of young feminists who are very tech savvy. On the one hand, so for example, in the Feminist Coalition, a lot of the young feminists have understood how they can capitalize on, say, digital technology, for one, to mobilize, but at the same time, understanding that mobilization cannot just be online. So how to connect the tech that
Yeah,
we
right.
have together with actual on-ground mobilizing. So ensuring that, for example, those who need to get justice have justice in a movement, mobilizing lawyers, mobilizing medical personnel, mobilizing people with resources to contribute to the movements. I think these trends aren't new. I think what is new about them is that they have moved to a more digital space. So I think that's something a really interesting trend. And I know a big contestation when we talk about, what is digital feminism today in Africa vis-a-vis uh, what we've been doing traditionally in terms of feminist mobilizing. And I think that's an area which is quite, I think, interesting, that intersection, right? Because it does create this challenge in terms of how do we own our stories, but also how is knowledge being produced also on those online spaces. So whereas the feminist coalitions, whether it's the Feminist Coalition in Nigeria or the young feminists in Sudan or in Kenya or in South Africa with Fees Must Fall, there are interesting things that have happened in terms of democratizing as well feminist theory. I think that is a thing that I have found to be really interesting. I just think of myself as a young person in Kenya when we didn't have internet access at the university, at the law university. I didn't have feminist text there was no way to get it. That information wasn't readily available to me. And when I look at the young women today, the way in which not only knowledge production is being done online, but the way in which information is being democratized and being shared in languages that make sense for younger generations who are coming, and being able to honor those feminists who have come before us, or those who have paved the way for the theories in which we're discussing today. I think that is something, at least on the African continent, is an emerging trend, and we shouldn't dismiss it. We shouldn't be quick to dismiss it. And we shouldn't be quick to dismiss the way also that knowledge gets reproduced on those platforms, right? And I say this with a caveat, understanding that when we come to a neoliberal look at who owns the digital space, we do also understand that there's a threat there in terms of who will end up owning the knowledge, or who gets to be accredited for this knowledge that is being created. So I think there's a tension there between how young feminists are using digital technology, but also being able to critique these digital technologies and platforms in the ways in which they co-opt, or the ways in which they take away agency from those who are creating knowledge. And then the last thing I just wanted to say was really around the young feminists have also been able to mobilize around issues that they feel affect them most. So I was just thinking yesterday of the ways in which young women, especially in our movements, help us to develop content knowledge. How do we recognize knowledge production and honor it, and be able to accredit it to especially those who may not have the status of the cloud, so beyond class, race, gender barriers, and that exploitation. This is a question that has been raised, especially as someone comes from, especially the women's rights organizations. How do we exploit young women's labor in the movement? How do we recognize their efforts when they do not have that kind of recognition? Do we cite them? Do we honor them? Do we make sure that they are really encouraged, but also recognized for the labor and the knowledge production that comes with their participation in our movements? So I think those tensions are interesting, but I also think what is interesting about them is that the trends amongst younger generations has been quite interesting, because not only are they willing to talk about it openly, sometimes in challenging ways, but also I think they have also embraced certain theories, feminist theories, in a way that I would say, if we didn't have this kind of technological or access to the internet, for some, and I do recognize that it's very class-based, this kind of information would not flow. And the last thing, we must understand, how does it move from the digital space? How does the knowledge production move from the digital space into movement? So for example, coming back again, finalizing with, how does that come to, say, for example, the Sudanese revolution? The use of that information and knowledge, how does it inform social movements, but also how do social movements inform the kind of knowledge production that happens? So this kind of circular motion of information and theory. So I'll stop there, because I think those are the things that I think are quite interesting. Obviously, my perspective is really from an online equality digital space, because I think there's a conversation for us to have in terms of how do we challenge the problematic neoliberal aspects of tech today, and especially when it comes to mobilizing and how we're using it to mobilize around social movements. Thanks.
Muthoni, thank you very much. I think you bring in a very relevant perspective, but I also like what you were saying about when you gave the example of Sudan, where in recognizing women's contribution in the liberation movement, we have media undermining collective feminism and focusing on an individual. And this is a theme and a point that has been coming up repeatedly in a number of the discussions we've been having in the festival. But I think what is most important there is, one, what it does in terms of taking away the power of the collective and downplaying what women are doing in terms of, disrupting and moving the agenda forward. And it is a deliberate project by the media, right? Because the media is part of the hegemony. If you think about it, if you think about who owns the media and what narrative do they want to be in the public discourse, it is only deliberate to want to take away from the power of movements and from the power of people that have historically been marginalized. And there is nothing that the system fears as women organizing. So that's deliberate, and it's important for us to keep that. And you also give us very great examples about what we're seeing emerging in terms of movements and the role that young women have been playing, the NSARS movement, but also the intersectionality of that. How women's feminists are working closely with other groups to build a larger collective. Historically, you would have been looking at what's happening within the labor rights movement, but the sites of struggle are beginning to shift in other spaces, the digital space, in the space of sexual and reproductive rights, in the space of identity and collective identities, and so forth. And I was also very excited about what you were saying around democratization of feminism and feminist theory, which is a project of popularizing feminist theory and the possibilities that technology is bringing. And some of the downsides of that. To move the conversation along as well, I'd like to bring in Aria, and to also invite you to comment on what Muthoni and Sarah have said, but also share your insights on where what we're seeing around popular uprisings. And what do we make of these popular uprisings globally, but also popular uprisings in the South? And you can bring it home to what we're seeing in terms of the importance of local organizing.
Thank you, Macero. Good morning, Macero. Good morning, sisters. I want to start by thanking your presence, the presence of everyone in the panel, such a beautiful people to spend a morning with. And to say, there's a Portuguese saying that says, our steps come from far away, which is like we stand in the shoulders of giants. And the honor of coming last is that everything that I wanted to say has been said by these two amazing sisters that went before me. But and so I'll be more reflective on what came up in my mind when the topic was given, which was theory of change for counter-hegemonies. And for some reason, which I'm starting to understand now, the sentence going back to the picket line kept coming back. I was like, I've never, been on the picket line of labor movements. I'm only 29 years old, but I kept reflecting on that, going back to the picket line, going back to the picket line. And I think what this means, it can mean different things. Of course, it means this, this theorizing, this organizing, looking back at what has been the history of labor organizing in the continent, in the world, the history of anti-colonial organizing, the history of anti-capitalism, anti-globalization organizing, and what lessons come from there in the sense of how to resist and how to challenge, how to envision a new world while challenging systems of power. And I think these are important lessons today where we see increasingly our organization become, or our movements becoming institutionalized. And perhaps, I dare say the future of feminist counter-hegemony perhaps lies in going back to the various picket lines that we might be having today. Whether these are digital, whether these are in real life, whether these are challenging, I don't know, corporate power, whether these are challenging autocracy that is, you know, coming in different shapes and forms in our context. I think this remains important. And here today, I remain inspired by the work of several women. I'm going to mention three, not because they're most important, because the three women that died in the picket line across the world. One is Mamfikile in South Africa, which gave us a huge lesson with the movement about anti-mining. So an agenda against, you know, the disruption of nature and bodies and women's bodies. Another one is Marielle Franco from Brazil, who yesterday completed 1,000 days since her death and her of a driver, who also gave us a lesson about being on the picket line of anti-racist and pro-democracy and feminist organizing for marginalized people in the favelas. And I'm very deliberate about including sisters in the African diaspora, because I think being from Angola, Portuguese-speaking country, fortunately or unfortunately, you know, we have this embryonic connection, you know, with sisters in Brazil and with Black sisters in the Lusophone diaspora, you know, that sometimes it's harder to translate, you know, when we speak to Anglophone or Francophone sisters. So it feels like an extension of home. And another one is Berta Cáceres, right, from Honduras. And I think that the life and death of these three women, for me, embody what the future of counter-hegemony organizing is. It's a future of going, and really Sarah and Modoni did a great service to me by talking about the power of popularizing our movements. So going back to the essentials, and on Django, the collective I'm part of, we keep, you know, making these reflections, not in as clear way, but a reflection on who are we breaking bread with? Who are we speaking to? Because often, particularly now that we're in this digital space, you can see the divide very clearly between people that are, you know, on your side and people that are not. And I fear that sometimes we tend to preach to the converted, and that's dangerous, because in our unintentional separation, we don't know where change is going to come from. I think change comes from the most unexpected of places. We can't plan social change. We can plan you know, how we're going to respond. So I think it remains crucial to cast the net wide and open our spaces of congregation, know who we're speaking to, which sisters are we allowing into our spaces, how are we changing in relation to the challenges that they bring to the table? Are we remaining the same? What agendas are we putting forward? And I think to a great extent, we are getting better at doing this by listening to sisters that come from transgender movements, that come from disability movements, the sisters that come from anti-racist movements. But I feel like our diversity must be wider, and therefore we must always be intentional about widening and creating spaces to receive people that we don't know exist. And I also speak about this because the experience in Angola, at least in the feminist organizing in Angola, has been an experience of us realizing the level of alienation that our youth have been currently suffering, not because they want, because it was constructed to be that way. You know, the political and economic alienation of people drives them away from agendas of change and makes them very easy prey for all of these anti-democratic forces, that are anti-feminist forces that keep emerging. And I know this is hard because for some time I didn't want to listen. I was tired, and we are right to be tired, right? But I know, and the sisters I might agree with me, that the challenge lies where we might be least comfortable. So the picket line for me represents the frontier of our comfort as well, in terms of who we decide that is worthy to engage on this feminist agenda. And perhaps therein lies the greater possibility for change that we want to see. But I really, wanted to say, and because a lot has been said, and I'm sure a lot of other sisters want to contribute, that in terms of organizing and the different picket lines that lie, I often speak in platforms like this, and I've noticed that, and Mudoni, thank you for mentioning this about the individualization of voices. I come from Onjango as a feminist collective. I often come because I'm one of the few ones that speak English. But I stand in solidarity, I stand together, and I work with a vast array of sisters that are fighting on different picket lines. Mine, as Masero said in my introduction, happens to be macroeconomic policy. But I want to take this moment to also mention and acknowledge the work of other sisters in the collective that are fighting different battles. I'm always inspired by Laurinda Gouveia, who, before being a feminist, before finding herself to be a feminist, was one of the 2 women arrested back in 2017 when they started the pro-democracy protest in Angola. And Laurinda, to this day, you'll find her not in a house, but on a street somewhere, convincing people to go to a pro-democracy march. That's Laurinda. And that's very inspiring, because how many of us continue to do that? She goes to markets with loudspeakers, and she's there trying to convince people that she doesn't know that on the 10th of December, then the youth are going to be marching because we want local elections that keep being delayed, because we want, we want better living conditions, and because we want more democracy. So that for me encapsulates where we should be moving towards. And I speak of this with emotion because, from the comfort of our computers, sometimes we forget those things that brought us to the movements to start with. And I think Laurinda encapsulates that very clearly. Sizaltina Kutaya, another sister that, in a closed environment that is Angola, from even before we could imagine, she was the person that kept going to television, kept using social media to challenge, the status quo. And I think this is an important picket line because women continue being marginalized from political discourse. And we, as feminists, are becoming increasingly skeptical of the political space as an arena for demanding our rights, because we are tired of the promises of putting women in power. We know this didn't lead us nowhere. And therefore we are just slowly moving out of this space, which I think is dangerous, because the space is going to be occupied, and it's going to be occupied by women authoritarians. Watch this. So I think Zotina continues to be, to me, an inspiration that this is also a space to occupy. We have Camille Lara, who's a filmmaker that recently made a movie about women that fought in the independence struggle from different liberation movements. It was a short clip, 15 minutes, that resulted from a trip that she made with her film collective across the country, where they were making a documentary about independence. But this very act of documenting our history, of deliberately saying that we were there in this history, and punctuating us, memorializing the contribution of women for the independence struggle, remains crucial today, because across the world we see an erasure of women of all types of history. So building what Sarah was saying about history, it's great inspiration. Aline Frazão, who sings beautifully and sings about liberation, sings about the present, and most importantly, sings about the future, the Angola we want. So using her art to challenge this narrative, this very, often intellectualized narrative, and many other sisters like Leopoldina and Chengita, who are building up, often translating of analysis from other sisters, many of you on this call, and often building on and theorizing what feminism means in the Angolan context. So it's very relevant. So this is to say what? Just a few examples that I know, limited, of where some of the possibilities for change that is not planned, that is not theorized in log frames, that is not calculated by indicators of success and markers of progress that remain relevant, that continue to inspire us. And I think this is what I wanted to provoke in our discussion today. Thank you, Masera, and thank you, sister.
Aria, thank you so much. I like the concept that you bring of picket lines, virtual and physical picket lines, but you're also bringing out conceptual picket lines, right? The theme of the day is around theories for change, but you're also challenging us to think differently about what theory means and where the spaces where theorization takes place, right? And you give us a very nice segue into where I'd like the conversation to go around what the possibilities are for transformative change between feminists and social movements. But before we get into that, there's a very important point that you made when you started naming some of the sisters who've been at the forefront of the picket lines, and you're picking sisters who've actually been left exposed and left what's the gosh, it's too early in the morning, I can't find the right phrase, but when you were talking about Betha Mamfikile, and the other sisters, what came to mind for me is that when we often think about counter-hegemony organizing, there's an important role that the international human rights movement plays, right? But here are sisters who were actually forgotten, unrecognized, neglected by the global human rights movement, in the sense that there's a particular conceptualization that goes into understanding and framing who human rights defenders are. So their struggles go unrecognized. They're not picked up in the media. They don't enjoy the kind of protection that a media activist, for instance, would have enjoyed. And in the end, when they're faced with violence, they've got very few spaces to turn into. So it's also to challenge us around the picket lines, who's framing them? How do we carve space? How do we shine the spotlight on the vulnerabilities that individual women expose themselves to once they take on these activist roles? And who steps up in terms of offering protection when it is needed, and continues to tell their stories in ways that capture the public imagination and draws on the importance of what it is that they're struggling for. You also buttress the point around individualization of voices, but at the same time, you go back to the importance of acknowledging that in some cases, individuals are our signposts for hope, right? And we must also acknowledge their contributions. We did say we wanted this session to be interactive. I'd really love to invite you to please share your comments, your feedback on the chat function and on the Q&A function. And while I wait for questions and comments to come in, I'd like to move along the discussion and bring in Sarah or Muthoni, any one of you who wants to comment on this, and is to build on to what Aria had started taking us through, which is what are the possibilities for partnership of transformative change between feminists and social movements, and how do we overcome the fragmentation within feminist movements across the global South? What are some of the issues around which we should be building these movements on? Sarah Muthoni, who would like to take that up and go first?
No,
Yeah, go ahead, Muthoni.
I can just quickly. I think when I saw this question, the thing that I was also reflecting around, especially the question on fragmentation of the movement, and two things. I wondered whether, that tensions are often often exist, and I wonder whether we see them only as problems or opportunities for expanding our thinking around either the feminist discourse. And why I say this as someone growing up on the African continent, these have been questions that have always been in the spaces. You know, what is this fragmentation and tensions? And if I think of one as the intergenerational one or class one, I wonder if, for me, it's about being able to be open and accountable to ask maybe the bigger questions rather than avoiding them. So in spaces, being able to be open and explore areas beyond our own comfort zones, as Aurea has rightly said, those picket lines which aren't necessarily the most comfortable for us, where we don't feel that we would like to go, being able to open that conversation up and interrogate why the tension or the tension exists. As I was thinking about it, I thought that one of the things I do like as a trend, and especially about movements today, is we have, you know, because of this democratization of knowledge, so we are questioning and interrogating the concept of intersectionality and how do we live it, and how does it sit within our own movements? How do we open space for having a more inclusive feminisms, more inclusive feminism, more inclusive discourses? So I think that is something that I'm seeing, that there's a willingness, at least among certain fractions or sections, if you want to call them that, of the feminist movement, to really challenge themselves beyond the traditional either blind spots that existed before, but as well as recognizing that also there will be multiplicities and there will be feminism. So what are those rallying cries that we will all come towards when the time is needed, so that fragmentation becomes really for us an opportunity to maybe explore deeper, perhaps, the ways in which we embody our feminist values, or the ways in which we deal with the tensions that exist between concepts as well, and the issues that we want to tackle with. I think it's not a solution or a proper answer to the question, but it's something that came up in my mind when I was thinking about tensions as an opportunity for us to dig deeper into this question of what does feminist solidarity look like.
So Masego, and thanks for that, Muthoni. I also firmly believe that difficult conversations can be the gateway to new learning and new sort of consciousness raising, and therefore, you know, the danger of overemphasizing the similarities and overlooking our differences can also be a source of a false unity, as it were. And so how do we create that spaces in which our differences need not necessarily define us, but also should not be brushed under the carpet? I just wanted to answer the question, Masego, by first saying, as feminists, let's take ownership of some of the successes that we have had in shifting the thinking and in shifting the narratives, especially feminists from the South. There was the question that you talked about in terms of how human rights has traditionally been framed in the North as being largely around sort of an articulation of the violence of individual civil and political rights. And there's been a whole architecture built around that globally, which was totally outside the experience. I mean, it is part of, but not the complete experience of women and gender non-conforming peoples from the South. Therefore, a more holistic and framing of human rights to include social, economic, cultural, and the entire sort of legal architecture, those pushes came from the South. They came from women from the South. The challenges within feminism themselves, the term intersectionality that we use very commonly now, that came through the framing and analysis of women from the South who had been pushing for years, and scholars such as Kimberly Crenshaw, who actually articulated it in a paper that she wrote. But bell hooks and women in the diaspora had been writing about the intersections of gender, class, race, economic status, sexual and gender identity, and even your geolocation, because all of those, in other words, the sort of sacred cows that were being foisted on us by the sort of progressive liberal movements in the North were challenged by women from the South. And these have become, sort of new framing and organizing theories, even for women, for global women's movements, So I think it's important for us to take, sort of ownership of the sort of successes and the sort of influence that we have had over the years. And these have built bridges towards conversations of solidarity, as well as a clear understanding of where our differences are. I'll repeat what Sylvia said in terms of fragmentation and so on and so forth. And I think it's not just leveled at feminist movement. Progressive movements the world over are being fragmented right now. I listened to the conversation yesterday about corporate, corporate power, and the fact that we are all now largely, at the behest of powerful corporate interests, a context in which 1% of the world's population controls 99% of the world's, economic assets. It tells you something about what we are dealing with now. These opaque corporate multinational institutions and the architecture they line up to ensure the sort of fragmentation of progressive movements, the huge military architecture, the huge sort of technological architecture, surveillance machinery, machinery to move money and goods at the, the sort of speed at which the extractive process now happens. The speed at which the sort of destruction of the not just of sort of community livelihoods and well-being, but also the sort of environmental ecosystem that we have, because this is hegemony not just over people, but over our environments as well. All of this, the sort of military architecture that's being lined up is pushing progressive movements, to the sort of margins of fragmentation. But there is a tactical as well as strategic thought that we must give this. You know, in essence, I mean, you know, I remember those large jamborees, the large UN conferences, where we women, you know, women all over the world made an impact on sort of the global sort of architecture and policy framework. Those days are largely gone. And therefore, there is a way in which we do have to divide our energies. We do have to divide our, I suppose, our expertise, our various interests, the lens with which we see the world, the sort of neoliberal experiment, the way in which it is adapting, the tools that it is applying in order to sort of cement that, that sort of white supremacy, northern, you know, hegemony over this sort of global world economic and sort of political order. I think it's right now, it's perfectly right for us, and I start from the sort of lens that change is not necessarily about large numbers. It's not necessarily about large numbers. It is much better if we do have these large numbers, but I think it's more important to have clarity, as Sylvia said in one of the, I'm repeating what Sylvia Tamale said in one of the sessions. Let's have clarity around what it is we are up against. Small is not necessarily bad. Creating different ecosystems at different points in the struggle is not a bad thing. The question is, how do we create points of connectivity, intergenerational connectivity, conceptual connectivity? You know, we're now being forced by this small thing called COVID-19. We're now having this interface in different localities. How do we adapt to these realities that keep our struggles rooted in our local experiences, that keep those ecosystems strong, but help us build the connectivity across those local experiences and systems? How do we create those bridges across those divides in our efforts to build theories that counter the current hegemonies? We don't want hegemonies of domination. We don't want hegemonies of power over. We don't want to replace the current architecture with a caricature of that very architecture, only that the players will be different, which is what many of us in the South are struggling with within the context of our sort of states. We've inherited these formations from a colonial experience, and they have largely not changed. But what the neoliberal exercise has done is made even those state formations completely, you know, dysfunctional. The only time the state is functional is one, when it's inflicting pain on its citizens. That's the only time you see the state machinery really working, the militarized state machinery. There is no effort to discuss in whose interest is this state machinery organizing against its citizens, even with the dictators that are sitting in those chairs and acting as brokers for this sort of next deal, So I guess, we have to be politically savvy to address where we are in the current situation, and we have to learn lessons. And there are lessons here for us, and I know we have had some sisters who were active in the sort of Arab Spring, and I'm more familiar with the context in Sudan, which we have repeated time and time again. It was women who were on the streets. It was women who went out on the streets in Sudan in large numbers from the entire country, from all walks of life, because it was their, it's their role to provide food to feed their families. So when the price of bread went up, it directly affected them. So they went out on the streets in large numbers. But now, in the sort of, the building of the new state of Sudan, those women in their large numbers are not there. They're being bargained away. So what is the savviness we need right now? What is the ecosystem we need to build right now in the different locations in which we find ourselves? What is it we need to do below the radar? There is power in silence. There is power in silence. What is it we need to do below the radar in order to build our consciousness, in order to critically build our analysis, in order to critically, build those links that are necessary? And where are the fault lines within our movements, as Muthoni also pointed out, because those two are important. Thank you.
Thank you. You both raise very, very important questions, which we should consider as we move towards having a discussion around, I think it's the question that you are asking, Sarah, around the tactics and strategic responses, and also just looking at whether regional feminist collaborations can be a stepping stone. The country level examples that you give with Sudan and a few other examples that have come up through the conversation, I think it's worth tapping into what lessons do we learn from that in order for us to understand and inform our organizing going forward, building on movements, building on collective efforts, building on individual movements, and connecting our struggles. I like that you all also are beginning to unpack for us this continuity and continuation of the assault on counter-hegemonic movements, and the role that the army plays, surveillance you talked about, the extractive industries, finance and markets. And I like how you wrapped it up around, this is a project of not just hegemony over people, but also hegemony over our environments. And how do we organize to respond to that? But I think what is also happening is the co-option of and the appropriation of feminist concepts and feminist language, feminist struggles for purposes that are not serving us, right? I mean, you look at the Trumpism and what Trump was doing around his anti-globalization rhetoric was to capture and use our language, but not for the same end, right? So we've got to really pay attention to how this 1% is stealing from the concepts that the women's and feminist movement have been building on over the years to capture the imagination of the public and mobilize, but they're doing it for objectives that are on the polar opposite of what we've been trying to achieve. So it's good to be alive to that. There's some questions that have come up in the chat. The one question from Anuradha, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. The question is, in what ways does women's mobilizing needs to change in the current context? And another question that has come up in the chart, and I encourage you to just read the chart as we go along, in case I move questions. I'm going to skip the comments and go straight to the questions. There's a question here that says, to any of the speakers, what kind of questions do we need to be asking about new and different understandings of the process of leadership? And then another question, no, actually, I think that's the only other question that is in the chart, and I encourage you to read the rest of the comments. But if we could answer those two questions about the questions that we need to be asking to understand new and different processes of leadership, and what ways does women's mobilizing need to change in the current context. And again, in no particular order, whoever feels moved to pick up on that, Aria.
Yeah, I've been trying to answer that question while also listening to Sarah, and I think they're related, and particularly where Sarah left off with the question of what we need to do below the radar, taking the aspect of tactics, right? And I'll start with a story, because as you're saying, Masero and Sarah also said, our experiences, our practice should inform our theory, right? So I can't speak from out of the blue. I can speak for what my feminist practice in Angola tells me. When we first created Onjango in 2016, we were too lazy to decide, who's going to be what we call our lead coordinator, because. So we decided that we're going to have a collective, and everyone, is going to be a coordinator. And it's remained that way for 4 years, going on 5 to today. We have a group of coordinators that is made of almost 15 now. And I can tell you, it has been the most difficult thing and most important thing we've done for our feminist organizing. Difficult because the entire way the world is structured, the entire way we think about organizing and leadership is conceptualized around having a chain of command. People approach us and they say, who's the director of the collective? People approach us and they say, okay, but I spoke to that person about that, but you said a different thing. What is your opinion about this? And, it's been a difficult journey, because the consideration of difference, the acknowledge of, Sarah, what you're saying about points of connection within our organizing, to inform our organizing, it's been crucial to also inform how we stand in the world. I remember our decisions, a lot of them are long and overdrawn, and they tend to slow the time of response, which has been really useful in the times of social media, where things are, you have a scandal today and you need to respond the next minute. So by the time we are ready to respond, often the scandal has subsided and a new scandal has appeared, because that's how things shift on social media. But my reflection on that has been that how comfortable are we with borrowed models of leadership that don't necessarily serve our purposes as feminists? And I'm not saying that it's wrong for us to have organizations and movements around structured chains of command, but are we challenging ourselves to see new ways of organizing in the way that we want to see reflected in the world? We're always challenging the status quo in terms of anti-democratic practices. Women don't have a voice, where people are marginalized. In our own organizing, are we reflecting the values that we want to see in the world? And I tend to think that sometimes we don't challenge ourselves that way. And I think perhaps this question of leadership is important, to think of different ways of organizing collective thinking, collective voices, collecting expressions of dissent. I don't think there's one way that, you know, the way Onjango is doing the answer, but I think it's definitely a different way. And I know it's different because it's hard. I think one day or the other, I would rather wake up and, you know, there be a boss, because things would be easier. But again, you see a trend in what I've been saying about where we comfortable and where we remain. We have different challenges. We're not, you know, we're not always the collective we would like to be, or where we would like to be. But I think that that's one of the things that we insist in being the struggle that we're going to make. And we are inspired by sisters all over. We are inspired by, you know, by women across history that have organized in this way, not only for ideological reasons, but for security reasons as well. You know, I remember when I went to the first march in Angola after I returned from being a student elsewhere in the continent, the advice my father gave me from his times in the student movement was, you have to have a march partner. You need to have one person at all times, you know, when, you know, this person knows where you are, you know, this person where this person is, you can't, this person needs to be in sight. And I think that is very symbolic of the woke in the feminist, you know, in the feminist organizing, and where we need to be in terms of being arms in arms with other sisters. So I'm very fond of creating co-leadership models that hold us accountable to the vision, because we all fallible. And at times, you know, at times one or the other will walk away from the collective vision that we have for the project, for the movement. And it's important that, you know, we create structures that hold us accountable, that enable different sisters to hold us accountable, different comrades to hold us accountable. So just a small contribution on that.
I just wanted to say something real quick, just picking up from Aurea's point of view. I think, I think, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I think you hit it on the nail, the head on the nail, the nail on the head, sorry. It is difficult. And I think that is it, because in a neoliberal capitalist system, we aim for efficiency. Efficiency trumps everything else, regardless of whether efficiency enables us to achieve the outcomes we seek to get. And I think, from my own personal experience, having just done a kind of co-leadership model in a very, not in a feminist space, but in an INGO space, which was completely ridiculous, to be honest, and I'm quite surprised that they agreed. Where as a unit, we decided that when that vacancy was available, we decided, instead of having exactly that kind of chief of command, because we all bring different skill sets, why don't we create a co-leadership model? And it was a great idea, and I really appreciate it. But it was so hard. It was so hard because the structure isn't built for co-leadership of feminist leadership, right? Because urgency, efficiency, all these kinds of values that we attach to leadership are not necessarily feminist values. They are values that really seek to keep, their patriarchal values that are, they don't serve us. And I think that's a really good point. And to Sarah's point around the things we must be asking ourselves are, even as we're talking about how the geopolitical context and the global context is changing as we're doing our movements, what methodologies or what values are we actually wanting to espouse, or are we investing in to achieve the change we want? And I think that's really something that is often difficult, but I think that journey must continue. We must be willing to, the idea of taking time, the idea of not always being 100 efficient, the idea of not having to, really having time. I really like this idea of sometimes laying low, because it gives you time to really think about, these are big picture issues which need a lot of reflection and time to kind of ingest and be able to strategize collectively. And I think making it a practice, you know, when something is new, trying to push for it in a world that doesn't accept it is always difficult. So I mean, I just, the comment was really, you know, from your comment, Aurea, but also the comment from about the feminist collective. And I think even the Black Lives Movement co-leadership has talked about how there's always this push for a leader. But also that's also a dangerous thing, because leadership also enables us to know where to attack and how to dismantle movements, right? So, and maybe we should see it as, like you said, as a tactic to keep movements alive and be able to keep on leveraging on the kind of skills and the different skills that everyone's bringing on board, so that when one of us is down, everyone else can then quickly reorganize and be able to hold that space, and the movement continues. So I think this is something I wish we would talk about, and I really, I wish that would be supported, and I think we shouldn't be, I guess in my case, we at the end of it, we asked ourselves the question, did we seem like we were failing? You know, because we weren't able to move as fast as was expected, or to deliver as fast as was expected. And actually, when we reflected about it with my colleagues, we actually said, no, this process was important, because it's also about shifting how organizations can see leadership and shifting those value systems. So I really appreciate that. The second thing I'm just going to say quickly, because somebody has raised it in a comment, if that's okay. And it ties again to what Sarah has mentioned, and it's something that I'm struggling with, and I think it's something that I think as feminists we should be also trying to find, you know, ways in which to tackle it. Is now that I find myself in a tech space, and now I find that, you know, a lot of times we're pushing for women to get online, we're pushing for activists to get online, we're pushing for all these things. And there isn't really a big discourse, as Sarah said, around not only surveillance, but around data and privacy, and how those are the big discourses where we need to unravel how we use the technology in a way that it serves us, as opposed to using it without a deeper reflection, and being able to influence the kinds of decisions or thinking that will determine what the digital space look like. I mean, right now, COVID, we are here on this platform, in this space, right? And so we can't do away with the tech. My question is, how do we, as movements, galvanize or understand the tech better, so that it serves us, as opposed to us being part of, as you said rightly, part of our kind of neoliberal agenda, capitalist agenda, to increase profits and surveil and ensure that, you know, get our data from us. I don't have, it's a question that I'm trying to unravel in my mind. It's not one that I have answers to, but I think within movements, as we're organizing these tactics, we must ask those difficult questions about where we are using tactics and tools. How do those tools impact on the ways in which we will be able to sustain our movements in the future? So, yeah.
Masejo, I saw a question on leadership.
Yes.
And I think, you know, how does that, what's the impact? How then must we relook the notions of leadership within our movements, given what we are talking about in terms of hegemony? And I don't necessarily have answers to this, because as Muthoni has rightly said, and Nuria, these are all pervasive notions that in a sense they're all pervasive, they're with us, we are part of this world, and therefore the ways in which we have to conform to these notions, even though they don't necessarily serve the interests or the, sort of values that we have as feminist leadership? These are important questions. And I think it's practitioners like Hope Chigudu and others who have asked us time and time again, where is the connection? Where is the connection between the head, the heart, and the soul of the movements, of the institutions and the organizations within these movements? What are the bargains we're making? Are we aware of the bargains that we're making? And how do we subvert? How do we subvert some of these structures that are imposed on us? And I think, just speaking for a moment to the soul, I suppose, of our organizing. I think, we've talked about how language is important. We've talked about, how we how we ourselves exercise power within our movements. And I have seen different kinds of leadership within the movements and institutions. I have seen the I leadership, in which there is total conformity to the notion that there must be a leader, and the leader who speaks as an I have achieved this, I am responsible, I do this, I do that. And you look behind and there is no one in that organization or institution or movement behind them. I have seen the leaders who exercise the we. We have done this. We are thinking this way. And I will leave it to my colleagues or my sisters or whoever it is to take you through it. I'm sorry I can't be at this meeting. My colleagues here will take you through it. And it's the colleagues that would be regarded in the sort of subordinate positions. The subtext to all that is, you may see me as the leader, but actually, everybody here is a leader. Everybody here is a leader, and everybody here contributes. And therefore, I'm going to vacate the space so that others can speak to various issues that we're trying to tackle within the organization. I've seen the we in leadership that exercises power in the form of not speaking, not dominating a conversation, and creating space for others within that formation to speak. And I've seen others, the we in leadership, exercising or trying to build different structures of leadership and engagement, the co-leadership that Tony speaks about the co-leadership models that Muthoni speaks about. But I mean, many of those are challenged even by the sort of, and I see the sort of we in leadership that thinks about, how are we going to mobilize resources for the movements that we want to see? In what way is the low-hanging fruit of the donor and philanthropy community to which I belong, how much longer do we want to pay homage to these institutions as merely sort of beneficiaries and subjects, other than as equal partners? And where do we go along that journey on our own? And where do we build collectiveness in response to some of the structural challenges that we in the feminist movement experience in mobilizing of resources, mobilizing of people. To what extent is the I in the organization or in the collective, perpetuating this notion of competitiveness, competition, through wanting to appear as the only shaper of what's happening in terms of trends, in terms of responses, in terms of doing, and to what extent is the we consciousness responding to this environment.
Sorry, I really hate to interrupt and to stop you, because this has been such a great conversation, but we are running out of time. And there's a question that has come for you, which says, Sarah gives a lot of generalizations. It would be good if she can give examples of what she's saying of changing hegemony. And like we said in various parts in this conversation, and I think Sarah was saying it herself, we don't necessarily have all the answers, and we won't necessarily cover everything in 90 minutes. The good thing about this conversation is it starts off a whole day of conversations that are going to be looking at strategies for change and resistance. So some of the questions that are coming up, the nuggets that have come up in this conversation, will be carried on throughout the day. And I really apologize if we didn't get around to answering your questions. I'd like to thank the panelists for and to quote one of the participants here, an inspiring conversation. A lot of people who have worked closely with me know I don't wake up at 7 a.m. for anything, but to commune in silence over a cup of coffee. And I couldn't have chosen a group of, this was just the perfect way to commune and to share insights with sisters around very difficult questions that preoccupy our minds, that have been a preoccupation of our various movements. We went into discussing the various phases of feminist organizing for constructing feminist counter-hegemonies, and important for us to capture her story and to pay homage to the various struggles and the leadership that feminists have shown throughout history. For us is the importance of what we're seeing around democratization of feminist theory and popularizing some of the feminist theory and feminist thinking and mobilizing, and the potential and the opportunity that the digital platforms have created for us. We talked about the dangers of individualization of voices, the rollback of that, but at the same time, acknowledging the important role that particular individuals who have put their lives at the forefront of their struggles have made in contributing to the struggles that we've been talking about. We began to unpack some of the uncomfortable and difficult conversations around how we deal with difference. And I like what was said about understanding that fragmentation is not something that is only happening within the feminist space, but it's something that is happening across social movements, and that perhaps not all the time is it necessarily bad for us to contend with difference, so that we don't build on a false sense of unity. We get to understand what those differences are so that we can build out of them. We did go into concrete issues around what it is that we're struggling against, what the sites of struggles for counter-hegemony are. Corporate capture came up, surveillance, the role of the media, the tools that the state and the establishment uses to close spaces and squeeze out dissenting voices. And lastly is the question around leadership and what is emerging there. And I think that that conversation around leadership is one that is going to carry out through the day as we talk about tactics and strategies. Please join me in giving a round of virtual applause to our panelists and to the participants. Some of you had to wake up very early. For some of you, it's quite late in the day. And I'd really love to thank you for being here with us today. Asante sana, rea leboga, siyabonga, obrigado. Thank you. Ciao, everyone.